workplace situations. Some news come out recently about the pandemic, and most people have suffered something in the pandemic, but apparently people who have got lots of money have found that they've got a lot more money than they had before the pandemic. They're the people who run the big business houses. They are the ones who control the muscle. We're going to talk about them because there's a lot of them around. Anton Guinea, good morning to you.
Morning, Robert Cameron. Thanks for having me again, and welcome to all your listeners.
Workplace issues, you've covered lots of them. We have the basic ones. They're about accidents and maybe pay rates and hours of work and overtime, all those sorts of things we've covered off. But tucked away, there are other little stories that you and your organisation constantly deal with, and one of them is the people who don't put on the car keys and the high-vis. They're the ones who put on the Louis Vuittons. What have you seen play out over the last couple of years that may be concerning you a little?
Well, one of the big things, Robert, that is really coming to the fore, more so since COVID, and I think occasionally we get little prompts by, say, something like last fortnight when Jack Trong from James Hardie was removed from his role for, in inverted commas, bad behaviour or not complying with the James Hardie Code of Conduct, right? So what we're seeing is now big organisations taking a stand against workplace bullying. Workplace bullying is not a new thing, and organisations like Beyond Blue have been talking about it for many years, and their 2014 study demonstrated that at any one time, get this, Robert, this statistic will floor you, I expect, that at any one time, 5 to 7% of employees in Australia are experiencing, which means in the last 6 months, workplace bullying. So nearly 1 in 10, at least 1 in 20 is suffering from workplace bullying. Now that's a horrific statistic, and that was in 2014. I'm going to say, this is my, I suppose, professional opinion on this, is that it's probably got worse since then. I don't feel like enough has changed over time to have improved those statistics, because we've seen everything from Brittany Higgins to, well, we've seen Brodie's Law many, many years ago, obviously, but this pandemic, for whatever reason, has started to highlight, and it's started to help organisations become more accountable. Because when you look at, say, something like the Great Resignation, right, Robert, so everyone's leaving their roles, especially in America and yes, in Australia as well. And so Inc.com came out with some research last week, and get this, the number one reason, bar none, and this is just two crazy words, and it wasn't workplace bullying, but the two words they said was that the reason that people leave organisations, especially at the moment, the Great Resignation, is due to a toxic culture. Toxic culture. Now, what's a toxic workplace culture? What makes up a toxic culture in a workplace? I think your listeners and you and I could probably say that if bullying's not a part of a toxic culture, there aren't so many other things that would be a toxic culture that would be so obvious, if that makes sense.
And bullying is the one we know most about is usually we've focused over the journey on schoolyard bullying, where a big kid will bully the skin, or a group of big kids will bully a skinny, bespeckled redhead. I suppose that's the old-fashioned one. That sort of nonsense gone on. But the word encompasses so many different methods, because it could be just a race or gender issue in the tea room in a workplace. It could be the foreman pressuring the staff members to reach targets. It could be management pressuring the foreman to pressure the work. There's so many layers to bullying. So just to have that word is not a good place to start, because it's across so many spectres, I imagine.
Oh, well said, Robert. And well, let's unpack what you just said then a bit further, because I think you're onto something. Some of this behaviour starts a long, long time ago for the people that carry out the bullying. It probably does start in childhood for whatever reason, and leaders end up taking some sort of a mental approach into their working life and then into their leadership. It's okay to do things like abuse or insult or use offensive language or comment, or unreasonable and unjustified criticism or complaints over time. And remember, bullying, like in the schoolyard, is not a once-off thing. So bullying, for it to be bullying, has to be ongoing, and it has to be constant, and it has to be unwanted, and it has to be in the workplace, for example. It could even be changing working arrangements or roster and leaves to deliberately inconvenience someone. If your intent is wrong as a human being, as a leader, the chances are that you may be bullying. Now, here's the thing. If your listeners are looking for a real summarised version, so I could tell you that it's things like, humiliating someone, especially in public, or excluding people, or refusal to acknowledge contributions, or teasing, or even practical jokes. Like we've heard over the years, the stories about apprentices, and I was the apprentice that got sent to the workshop for a, in inverted commas, long wait. So I got to sit down there for a little while and reflect on why I wasn't being given a long wait. Actually, was. But
an oldie but a goodie, Anton.
Or an air hook mate and all those other sorts of things. But, if I was to break it down for you, Robert, I've sort of spent some time thinking about this, how I could crystallise this for anyone listening. So what's bullying behaviour? It's abusive, it's aggressive, or it's abrupt behaviour to another human. Abusive, you're a so-and-so. Abrupt, don't talk to me now, you're not my priority, I've got other important things to do. Or I'm changing your work conditions now, thank you, bye. Or just aggression, so just that tone of voice or that attitude where always on the attack as a leader instead of really listening and actually being empathetic towards how other people are thinking and feeling.
There's been circumstance, and I remember one in my own workplace many years ago where someone found out later someone needed to be got rid of, but they couldn't get rid of them, so they got rid of their position and encouraged them to apply for another position, as I was. But the difference was that I was told not to worry, the job was already mine. The other bloke's going to come second. And that didn't sit comfortably with me at the time, and since has actually made me quite angry that it took place. But it seems things like that are very common. They call it restructuring, don't they? But it's a way of removing unwanted staff members. So in a way, it falls into the same category.
And it does, certainly. And the challenge of redundancy is a real interesting one, Robert, because we can't actually make humans redundant, as I'm sure you know. We can only make positions redundant. So to do redundancy, I guess, with the right intent is to actually make the position redundant and then move that human to another role, not move them out of the business, basically, is probably the correct, the ethical, the empathetic way to do redundancy, and to actually retrain. And as Richard Branson said, train people so they can leave and treat them so they'll stay. And what leaders tend to sometimes, I guess, jump to is the quick solution, which is potentially removing people from organisations instead of the coaching avenue where, as a business coach and as a human coach, for me, that's the right approach. And we know from studies that leadership coaching, for not only the person that is struggling with the leader, but also the leader to help them with their relationship with that human who they're thinking about making redundant or their position redundant, to actually get rid of the person, which is really not right.
No.
But, we've got to be thinking about these decisions differently as leaders. We've got to be thinking about human. We've got to put a human approach to this and be humanist. And, and a lot of this comes from, Robert, leading under pressure. All of a sudden, the economy changes, or COVID shows up, or something else happens, and all of a sudden leaders are under pressure to save money, to cut. And as Simon Sinek says, think about a heart count, not a head count. Isn't that an interesting concept?
Yes.
Heart count.
Yeah, very much so. I want to talk about something else, and you may be aware of how the legalities in the organisation that you're in. And I've not been personally involved, but certainly know of people who do. As subcontractors to, let's say, a construction company, ABC Construction, they're going along nicely, whacking up houses and sheds, and they're employing subcontractors, and they've got all this continuity of work. And then all of a sudden, Friday night, ABC Constructing go into receivership. And the first ones, of course, not to get paid are the workers. So workers' entitlements, if you've got staff on, it's quite possible for people actually to be not paying superannuation. I don't know how that's possible, but it seems that you can just forget to pay a staff member's superannuation, and then when all falls over, that's the last of the entitlements that get paid. And then I'm hearing that then later on the same people in the management of ABC Construction start up DEF Construction and away they go again. Is that sort of real, or have I been misguided on that type of thing?
Well, you mentioned the word legally, right? So let's go back to legally, and let's go back to, I guess, and the one human on the planet that we've got to thank for our current proprietary limited structure, for example, which means in business that an organisation is an entity. So Armand Peugeot, in his wisdom when he was sort of building the Peugeot car company, decided one day to get some lawyers together and decided that his business should be separate from him as a human. So back in primitive times when we were in business, we'd be able to make, let's say we were boot makers, we'd be able to make one pair of boots at a time. And so we were very restricted by what we could do. We were one-person bands, and there was no such thing as a business. If those boots didn't work, someone would come back to us. But all of a sudden, when Armand Peugeot came along, he said, no, that's not right. I don't want to be held responsible personally for what I do in business. So if that car doesn't work, that's not me. I'm Armand Peugeot. And I'm not saying that I love Peugeot, I love cars, I love Toyota, they're our main client. I'm just using this is historically what happened. And the law followed him. The law said, you know what, we think you're right. We think there should be these entities called organisations, and they should be separate from the human entity. So now, and if you read the book Sapiens, it'll tell you that things like this are myths, they're common beliefs. There's no real, it's a human construct, the organisation or the entity in accounting. And so these business owners aren't legally responsible for what happens in their organisations, would you believe? Because they've divested responsibility from themselves personally and legally into this entity that's a nothing thing, that's a piece of paper, that when the business falls over, it's the piece of paper that gets ripped up and all of the debts and all the other things that go along with it. And if it's a big enough company, all of a sudden we call in administrators and other things. But legally, that human can then go and start, unless they've been made bankrupt, for example, and then there's some restrictions on directorship in organisations. But essentially, the human that was running the organisation, who owns the organisation, which was the entity which they're not liable for, could the next day go and do something else in business and start all over again and just cut their ties with the entity that sort of hurt other humans and that didn't pay their subbies and that didn't pay super and that was the entity's problem. That wasn't my problem. That was the business. That was the business entity. And then it's left to lawyers and accountants and administrators. And there's such we look at those three things, there's three thriving industries that have got to go and sort out who should get paid first and how much should get paid out of what's left over. Because what's happened is the humans running the entity have overcommitted and they've grown too fast, and all of a sudden they become what's called insolvent, so that they can't pay their debts on time, which means that they've got more financial commitments than they have got income or turnover. So they've overcommitted. So they've made decisions that affected the entity, and all of a sudden the entity has affected the people that it owes money to that can't pay for them. But legally, they can then go and do something else. But then there's the moral dilemma, Robert, of is it really cool for a business owner to be going and doing that? And here's the thing, that we, as business owners, we have a legal responsibility to follow the Corporations Act and do everything legally, but we also have this moral obligation to the humans in our care. I hire people in my organisation and I'm responsible for them. One of the big things in 2022 I've predicted for leaders is social responsibility. We all have a corporate and a social responsibility to care for others and the environment and those around us in a way that we don't do harm. And this is the challenge. While there's a business entity that sits off to the side that doesn't hold people responsible, there's no moral, there's a law that says, well, maybe we'll make you bankrupt and therefore you can't do anything, but there's no moral comeback on these people. It's only the conscience that sits on their shoulder when they look themselves in the mirror. And some people are okay from a what's the right word? What am I looking for? For a
conscious point of view, yep.
Yeah, conscience point of view. They can just go and do something and do it again and potentially again. And all of a sudden, they've heard a lot of families and lives along the way. So legally and morally are two different things, as you know, and it's how we encourage morality in business, Robert, and how we encourage leaders to be more humanist and to care for the outcomes of their decisions, not just think, well, they're not liable because it's the business making the decisions. No, it's not. It's the human making the decisions.
Yeah, it's a bit of a frustration. It seems to be getting more and more out of hand. There's more protection to the individual. So I suppose the individual can set up the company, draw a wage, and in some cases that might be $1 million a year if that's what they so desire to pay themselves, and then that almost absolves them of responsibility of what goes on inside the house, and even to things like if the business starts to get wobbly and it looking like it's not going, you can just give yourself a pay rise and it'll get a bit more out before the ashes arrive. It's just a bizarre structure that doesn't protect, as you correctly pointed out, the heart element of the business.
Oh, and then, mate, what you say is so right. You know, then you look at what you've just summed up then is this hard element of the business. Let's think about for a moment, and if anyone's tracked it, Elizabeth Holmes, who was the lady who ran an organisation called Theranos, or built this organisation called Theranos. And she became, I guess, a billionaire fairly quickly, and recently has been charged with fraud and potentially will serve many years in jail. Now, she lives in a $100 million mansion still. And so, you know, you think about how these people get to the positions that they are in business. And I've followed Elizabeth Holmes very specifically because I've just been interested in how she raised money from really smart people. So there were some really, really, really smart people that invested in her business, and her business was around blood testing and some technology that was going to revolutionise blood testing that she knew, or the business knew, wasn't going to work. But she kept asking for very, very large donations and very, very large investments into her business, right? And all of a sudden one day it all fell over. And of course she goes on and she's probably made herself wealthy out of that business. But she's done it in a fraudulent way. She's grown her business in a fraudulent way, which is now being proved in the courts. And I just, you know, and I look at people like that and I try to unpack from a psychology perspective, Robert, this heart stuff that you were talking about. And I think about, did she really believe that potentially this thing would work? Or did she know right from the start that there were some problems with this and she wasn't willing to admit that because she was on this drive train to financial freedom? And I wonder whether business owners just get so caught up in the pressure of day-to-day business and that they just, or whether it's a lure of money, whether it's, well, maybe it's just a lack of care factor for other humans. How do we bring the heart into business, and how do we unpack what people like Elizabeth Holmes did and say, you know what, how do we prevent it, or how do we train leaders? Is there a business school that we can send people to?
Well, I reckon there's plenty of successful ones around operating already, and we're probably making out that all people in business are bad, but they're not. You go around and you'll find some wonderful family businesses where people have worked there all of their lives because they want to. They're rewarded for their efforts. They're encouraged to be part of the ownership of the business. So they've got some skin in the game. There's some wonderful stories around. The models are already there, Anton. I suggest we just promote them more and the others less, and make it less opportunistic. Hey, we've run out of time. When we get back, we're going to talk more about, when we get you back, which will be 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to talk more about this heart thing, the individual, the human element, what the uniqueness of each human element there is, because I know you're into that sort of space, and we're going to pursue that a bit more. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you for making people more understanding of what's going on in the world around them and why things happen, because that's what we try to do here.
You're a champion, and thanks for having me.
See you, mate. All the best. Anton Guinea, he is a good lad. Good discussion this morning. We'll have more of